Okay, welcome back. So before we were talking about Bonza and them removing 5 routes, and obviously potentially how their network could change over time. A couple of weeks ago, Bonza basically attended a kind of parliamentary inquiry that was looking at competition in Australia, and particularly it was looking at industries which were dominated by 1 or 2 major players, of which aviation was therefore involved. And Bonza were talking about the problems they're having trying to take on this kind of duopoly of Qantas and Virgin. And they were also talking a little bit as well about the problems they've having getting slots at Sydney Airport. Jake, tell us a little bit more about what was said then.
Yeah, this was at Toowoomba at the end of last month. So there was sort of a bit of a road trip there from the House Committee on Economics. They went up to Toowoomba, they went down to Melbourne. This was in Toowoomba. Bonza CEO Tim Jordan was there, and the CEO of airline investments at 777 Partners, which is the owner of Bonza, Manish Raniga. Hope I said that right. He said that what the 777 Partners CEO said was that Sydney Airport is going to be vital. Getting access to Sydney is going to be vital for Bonza in the future, because Western Sydney Airport is still 3 years away, and Sydney Airport is the only game in town if you want to access the Sydney Basin. Love you, Newcastle, but you're a bit far. And so Manish Raniga said that, quote, the length of runway for Bonza is going to run out if the airline can't get appropriate access to Sydney. He said, whilst we have been able to convince Australians, Tim Jordan has certainly been able to convince the shareholders that there is an opportunity, and we are going to continue down this path. At some point in time, not being able to serve the Sydney catchment is going to constrain growth and hamper our ability to create more opportunities for consumers. Now, Tim Jordan said that Sydney, from a catchment perspective, is getting close to a quarter of the population. It's between 20 and 25% of the total market. And he said if we as a business are unable to access that market, it has a significant impact on us and our ability to bring low fares. We see the opportunity to open up many new markets into and out of Sydney, which are currently serviced by one stop, whether that is via Melbourne, Brisbane, or other ports. And he said that being shut out by Sydney is, quote, making a hard execution harder.
Now, just to give people a little bit of background information, one of the issues, or 2 of the issues Sydney's got, is one that effectively it's full to bursting. That is why we are building another massive airport out to the west. The second issue is this idea of slots. And when we talk about slots, we mean the literal takeoff time. And obviously, some slots are better than others. Ideally, I think you want to fly between, say, 6 and 9 in the morning. And obviously...
in the evening as well.
Yeah, exactly. So some slots are better than others. Now, the rules for how we allocate slots in Australia, like with many other countries, is what they call the 80-20 rule. And basically what it means is if you've got a slot, you can keep it forever as long as you fly 80% of the time. And this has led to the ACCC and a lot of people in the industry saying that effectively airlines can kind of game the system. What they can do is take a slot they don't necessarily need, knowing that they can cancel a large amount of them and still hold this good slot forever. Now, one of the interesting things about this is Sydney Airport themselves, who kind of enforce the rules, but it's not their idea. They don't agree with the way this slot rule works. They think it's in need of reform. Sydney Airport obviously wants to see more competition. It wants to see people like Bonza come in. But it's very, very fascinating that Bonza are talking about this sort of kind of perfect storm of things, and they are saying that, it's going to stunt our growth. We can only go so far as a company until we get access to Sydney Airport.
They're already operating out of one capital city airport, Melbourne Airport, and that's been doing quite well for them, I believe. But it's like Tim Jordan says, Sydney is Australia's major international gateway.
Absolutely.
It is the biggest, busiest airport in the country. And, it serves Australia's biggest city, whatever Melbourne might say. And so...
they may have better coffee, but we've got the better slots and airport.
And better beaches.
True story.
But
we love you, Melbourne.
Tim Jordan did say he sort of hinted that he suspects that there is quote something else going on other than the weather in Sydney. In as far as slots are concerned, he said in the report that you refer to. referring to the committee, as well as in the recent ACCC report, it seems to imply, and there seems to be general consensus, that it's more than just the weather in Sydney. Unfortunately, that means we're unable to access Sydney. That is unfortunate for 6 million people in that catchment.
So again, to give you a bit more context here, and actually, as well as Tim Jordan from Bonza appearing at this inquiry, also Virgin sent their chief legal officer, and basically what she basically came out and said was nobody is kind of gaming these takeoff and landing slots. That's not the case at all. In fact, as she said, the exact word was there's not a sinister motive behind the high cancellation rate there. It's because of the complexities of flying from Sydney. And these are things we've talked about in the podcast previously. It's the fact that if you have wind, if you have fog, that can have huge...
What I find interesting, though, Adam, and I'm not starting a legal fight with Virgin at all, and I'm not accusing anyone. I always put a disclaimer. I'm not accusing anyone of anything untoward. But what I find interesting, when we had all of those issues at Sydney last week and the week before with ATC being down to one runway, Virgin was the most affected airline with the most cancelled flights out of any carrier. It didn't affect Jetstar as badly as it affected Virgin. It didn't affect Qantas or Rex as badly as it affected Virgin. And I think on one particular morning, Virgin cancelled a total of 16 flights within a morning period.
The problem with all of this is that it's very, very hard to make any definitive allegations against one specific airline and one specific time. And it is for that reason that the ACCC, who kind of extraordinarily did actually come out and effectively say, we believe that you can take advantage of this system, but they never actually said, we think one airline has done this at one time.
Yeah.
You would think that they would have a mountain of evidence, but they clearly don't think that evidence is strong enough to make a particular point. So Virgin has come out there and basically there is not a sinister motive. This is purely due to the complexity of operating at Sydney. Nonetheless, it does feel like a kind of perfect storm. And like Jake was saying, you know, we are going to have another airport in New South Wales that will go a long way to alleviating this, but it's not going to open for years. And when it does open, it's going to be in a staggered start. It will take decades for this thing to become the kind of beast it eventually will do. And the problem is it's all very well and good saying, oh, well, future generations won't have this problem. If you're Bonza, you don't really care. You need to build your business right now.
Well, and New South Wales consumers want Bonza here now as well. It's proven that we definitely want Bonza flying out of New South Wales or flying out of Sydney or Metro anyway. I guess what I would say to this, if Qantas and Virgin aren't that worried or threatened by Bonza, give them a slot or two. Give up one of your slots to allow Bonza to come in.
And one thing that Tim Jordan was also saying is, it goes back to what you were saying, Adam, as well. Slots in the middle of the day are not especially used for them. They need to be flying at those peak morning and evening periods.
So one of the points that Virgin made when they appeared is I say quite extraordinarily, but Virgin basically came out and said, we do not believe there is a problem with the slot system. And you could say they would say that. But they also made the point that effectively what she was saying was you've got to kind of earn your stripes. She's like, well, there are slots at Sydney. Yes, they're the off-peak ones, but you need to get into the system and then maybe further down the road you can upgrade them. But nonetheless, some slots are considerably more valuable than others.
Absolutely,
like,
they are.
Wants to fly in the middle of the day, but you cut off so many of your travellers. Obviously, you just generally cut off all business travellers.
Leisure market, absolutely. The business traveller does not want to fly down to Melbourne at midday and then have to spend an extra night away for a meeting the next day. They'd rather get on a 6 a.m. departure, be in Melbourne in time for 9 a.m. with a coffee in hand, off to a meeting, day full of meetings, back to the airport to fly home, unless they've got to overnight for back-to-back consecutive day-to-day meetings. But for the leisure traveller, if I was travelling domestically and it was cheaper for me to travel at an off-peak time, I would certainly put my hand up for that. But the business travelling market, not at all.
So in terms of kind of like what the solutions are to this in the short term, now Rex's Deputy Chairman John Sharp, who I've interviewed on this a couple of times actually, and he ironically was the man who actually introduced this rule when he was Transport Minister, and as he told me, it has come back to bite him on the bum.
Well, if it isn't the consequences of my actions.
Yes,
absolutely.
yes. Now he basically said we were too generous with this 80-20 rule, and really it should be more like 90-10 or perhaps even less. But nonetheless, I don't see any actual progress in changing this rule. You've had the ACCC come out very strongly and say we don't agree with it. You've had Sydney Airport come out and say we don't agree with it. But it doesn't feel there's any...
No one's prepared to do anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which does feel like a more broad problem with all of Australian
just
politics.
To throw a totally random idea out there, I wonder if, and listeners, do write in and share your thoughts here. I wonder if Bonza would consider Bankstown Airport.
Is Bankstown Airport suitable for jets?
It can take jets, absolutely. I'm not sure if it could take something as large as a 737 MAX. That I would have to absolutely research. I know that there's been some jets that have done an emergency landing there in the past due to unforeseeable circumstances, but I wonder if Bankstown Airport would be open to Bonza.
Well, if the trouble is, if it's not open to the MAX, then the MAX is the only thing that Bonza has.
Correct.
You can't land at Bankstown if your jet won't fit there. So.
Very true.
Do you need a consultancy fee if this goes through? Because it does feel like, you need to be
they
charged
heard
with
it
this
here
stuff.
first.
Yeah.
They heard it here first on the podcast.
Right. Well, on that note, we're going to go for one more break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the week's news. We'll be back in a minute.